Hello, and welcome to the Museum of the Great Southern's Tuesday Curatorial series, the online version. Today I want to talk to you about a decade in Albany's history. Now, this series is called A Decade in a Year, and today we'll be looking at the 1920s in Albany, a significant time, just of course 100 years ago from now. Now, we often think about the 1920s perhaps as a decade of fun, of parties, of recovery, the Roaring Twenties as they're often referred to, but perhaps that wasn't the case for Albany. Well, by the end of this talk, you can perhaps make up your own mind. Now, the 1920s was coloured very much by the 1910s, because the 1910s, of course, was the decade of the Great War. The war that was supposed to end all wars, but didn't. It took a great toll on all communities, including Albany. A lot of young men never returned, a lot returned, but were scarred, both physically and mentally. So by the time November 1918 came around, everyone was hanging out for the war to end. There'd been enough carnage, enough destruction. And Albany was no exception to that. The end of the war in 1918 in November was a cause for great celebration, as you can see on this picture now. This is outside the town hall, of course, in York Street, Albany, and people had gathered to celebrate and commemorate the end of 4 years of fighting. But Albany got it slightly wrong. Well, along with a few other communities as well. We actually jumped the gun. We celebrated the end of the war too early. And I'll read a little bit from Don Garden's book about the end of the Great War. And he writes, on the 8th of November 1918, news reached the Advertiser, the Albany Advertiser, that Germany had capitulated. Immediately the news became known in the town church, and fire bells started ringing, ships blew their sirens, and whistles and bunting and flags appeared on the buildings. Business houses and shops were closed as people flocked into the streets and began gathering outside the post office in the terrace. When the town band arrived, an impromptu procession was formed, making its way through the streets to the town hall, where speeches were made and the crowd sang the national anthem and Rule Britannia. The rejoicing continued all day, culminating that night with a combined church's Thanksgiving service in the town hall. The following day, news arrived that the war actually wasn't over. A cable had been sent inadvertently that the war was due to end, but had been sent too early. So by the 11th of November, Albany had to celebrate again when the war was officially declared over. And we reconvened and had celebrations once more, but it was all a little muted at that time because of the early celebrations. The first major visitor of the 1920s to Albany was probably the most important and the one who drew the biggest crowd. In early 1920, this ship arrived in Albany Harbour, the HMS Renown, a British warship. It had been actually converted to a royal ship, and it carried the Prince of Wales on his voyage around the world. I believe they actually put in a squash court for the Prince of Wales on the HMS Renown in later years. But he came to Albany. Why did he come to Albany? Well, he came to many parts of the empire to thank us for our part in defeating Germany during the Great War. He came here only briefly in June 1920, and here he is on the steps of the town hall being greeted by the mayor. The mayor you can see in his cloak and robes in the centre, and the Prince of Wales is just to the mayor's left, wearing a hat, looking down. Looking a bit cold, I must say. It was a cold day in Albany in June, and it's interesting, a couple of sidelights which I really like about this visit. He only spent a few hours in Albany, sailed in on the HMS Renown and then caught the train to Perth. While he was here, he wouldn't have noticed, I'm sure, in the town hall that there was a couple of films that were being shown at the town hall because that was a picture venue. And if you look closely, you can see on the right-hand side of the door, there's a poster for a film called The Flying Fortress. And this was one of the famous serial films that was running, a silent film running in the 1920s, starring an actor named Fatty Arbuckle, who's long disappeared into the mist of history, but Fatty Arbuckle was a very big star at that time. and a couple of years later featured in a sensational trial which to me reflects a lot of what's going on in America at the moment, in Hollywood especially, because he was charged with the rape and murder of a young actress, an aspiring actress. He was acquitted, but died not long afterwards, an early death, but that was Fatty Arbuckle in The Flying Fortress. But on the other side, on the left-hand side of the door, our right as we're looking to it, is another film starring Mary Pickford, who was one of the big silent screen stars of that era and one of the early Hollywood moguls. Prince of Wales' visit to Albany was short and sweet, but we almost succeeded in changing history a little later on in that visit, because the Prince was taking the train down towards Bridgetown on from Bunbury, and there'd been so much rain in that part of the world that the train actually came off the tracks in a muddy section. The carriage was overturned. The Prince of Wales was uninjured. He apparently emerged from his carriage clutching a cocktail shaker, as the train was going so slowly at the time. But just imagine, we could have changed the course of history, because the Prince of Wales later became King Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne after his marriage to an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. But if the Prince of Wales had been killed on his visit to Western Australia, we would have been that part in history. It didn't happen that way. The mayor at the time was a gentleman named Jack Day, and here we see him. He was the mayor in the early part of the 1920s, only till 1921, but he played a significant role. He came from a family of bakers. He'd come from South Australia and set up in a bakery business with a gentleman named Mr. Phillips. The original business was named Day and Phillips, later became Day Brothers, which could be familiar to some of you viewers today. He was our first mayor of the 1920s. He resigned in 1921 and was later replaced a little bit later on by Mayor Edward Balston, and he was a builder. We'll talk about him a little bit later in this talk. But Mayor Jack Day had a very important role to play, because at the end of the war, Australians and people worldwide were keen to commemorate the sacrifices that everyone had made. So a memorial was commissioned, and you can see in this next slide the plaque that is on the War Memorial, originally called the Fallen Soldiers Memorial in York Street in Albany, just outside St John's Church. Many of you will be familiar with its position. And on that plaque it shows that the Mayor, Mr W.J. Day, unveiled the plaque on Anzac Day 1921, alongside the Governor of West Australia, Sir Francis Newdigate. The War Memorial was commissioned by public subscription, but there was controversy over that as well. As we look at the next picture, here's some of the unveiling pictures of that day. Another bitterly cold day in Albany and wet in 1921. A big crowd attended, but they were probably unaware of the fact that there had been a lot of controversy over the building of this memorial. The contract was let to a monumental mason named John Hartman, and John Hartman was the best of the monumental masons in Albany. He did a lot of masonry work around town, was an expert stonemason. But during the war, he was targeted because his family was German. In fact, he dropped one end off his name. So it is, I think, quite ironic that our memorial to our fallen soldiers was built by a German, one of those men a few years ago who was maligned by the local population, and his family were abused because he had a German heritage. It's quite sad and ironic when you think about it. The War Memorial, of course, is still there today. Next year it celebrates its 100th anniversary. And for many years, alongside the War Memorial, there was a captured gun, a war trophy they were called. And these war trophies were awarded to the victorious sides, and this gun was apparently a Turkish gun that was captured in the Desert Campaign of 1917-18, which is commemorated, of course, by the Desert Mounted Corps Memorial on Mount Clarence in Albany. I'm not sure when this gun disappeared. I think sometime in the 1950s or 60s. We need to go back and look at some photos to confirm that. But it was an interesting part of the decor and public art of York Street at the time. Now, along with the sombre recollections of wartime, there were some great ideas coming up around the country, ideas to get the country back on its feet. And Albany had a few of those projects close at hand. And probably the best known one, and one of the earlier ones in the 1920s, involved this man, C.J. Clement John de Garis, sometimes known as Jack. And he planned a scheme to, I suppose, to fire up the area in the hinterland of Albany, to get it productive, because he'd worked in the Mildura area around the Murray River on dried fruit in particular, and he had a particular skill and knowledge and ability to enthuse people and to build up new industries. Around the Sunraysia area, which is actually a name that he patented himself, of Mildura, he set up this scheme which was called a closer settlement scheme. Now, the closer settlement scheme was based on small blocks, highly productive fruit orchards, apples, grapes, dried fruit, to become dried fruit. He would then process the dried fruit and then arrange for it to be exported. And he hit on the area of Kendalup as a prime target. Now, why Kendalup? I'll talk about that in a minute. But let me show you some of the early footage that de Garis actually commissioned by a cinematographer named Fred Murphy. He was a pioneer cinematographer in Perth in the 1920s. De Garis commissioned this film because he was a great self-promoter and he encouraged people to invest their money with him. He was a very charismatic man, full of good cheer, full of ideas. So I'll show you a little bit of this silent film, and you can just get an impression of how Kendalup looked back in the 1920s when de Garis had plans to develop it. Now, that's fascinating footage, isn't it? Just to have a look at how people rallied around and were full of excitement and enthusiasm about this great plan. And this map, which of course you won't be able to see the detail of, but this was de Garis's plan of the subdivision of Kendalup. His name is actually on this map. And if you look closely, you can actually see the road running through. That's the black line on the left, that is Albany Highway. And the black line on the right of the picture, as we're looking at it, is the railway line. And the railway was the key to de Garis's settlement idea. The railway, which of course connected Perth to Albany, would take the produce that was grown at Kendalup to market, to shipping, to ports, and to markets further afield. So Kendalup was built on the railway, and it was built around the old estate of the Hassel family. Now, the Hassel family sold off their large tracts of land around Kendalup in the early 1920s to de Garis. I suspect he got it at a bit of a knockdown price. And this was his money-making venture. He would invest money into the township. People would pay a small-ish amount. It was a good deal, and he would help them set up their orchards, and he would process their fruit for export from Kendalup. Here's a picture of CJ, as he was universally known, on the oval at Kendalup. So he got everybody working for him. So the question is, what happened to Kendalup? It is still there, but there's not a lot of sign of de Garis. There's not a lot of sign of the development of the dehydrator, the dried fruit industry, or any such thing. It's a sad tale. De Garis overreached himself. He was not helped by a bit of bad luck and a bit of acrimony between some people that he had offended in previous years in the eastern states. The upshot was that he couldn't borrow money that he had hoped to actually develop the town, to set up halls, to set up dehydrators and processing plants. So the scheme foundered. People were not getting the income that they were promised. The trees were being harvested, but the export markets were not there. And de Garis, try as he might, he even went to America to try and raise funds from American banks. He failed in raising more money. And by that stage, he'd reached the end of his tether, I think, certainly suffering from what we call today depression. He made one attempt on his life, a faked suicide attempt, returned to Melbourne, but couldn't face his creditors, and eventually he did take his own life in 1926 in Mentone in Melbourne. A sad end to what was a fabulous project, and one that was going to bring life to the Great Southern. Also in the 1920s, another scheme eventuated. Here's someone laying a foundation stone at a building. And you can see from the heading that the building is the Albany Woollen Mills, actually officially the Albany Woollen and Worsted Mills. Now, what's the background to this? Here in the next picture you can see the actual opening day, February 1925, a grand day in Albany. And this again was going to bring wealth and employment to the town. So the background to the woolen mills, how did that work? Well, the state government after the war was looking for ideas and innovation to bring investment, to bring new industry, and to take Australia, and the state of course, out of those doldrums that they suffered during the 1910s. And this was one of the ideas, to process wool. Wool was, of course, by then, one of the chief industries of Australia and the state. We had areas being opened up for wool everywhere. The climate was suitable, the breeds were suitable, but we didn't have a processing plant to value add, in modern terminology, that product that was coming off the sheep's back. So the government decided that it would invest in a mill to process this wool, and there was a lot of competition between different regional areas to set up this woolen mill in a town or a centre. Fremantle was keen. It would have been quite logical, really. Collie was keen. It had the power, had the processing power. But Albany, we had an advantage because the Premier at the time was also the member for Albany, and he advocated for Albany and lobbied, and finally, with a lot of community help and assistance and investment, the Albany Woollen Mills was created in 1925, February it was. It was a grand opening day for Albany. Here is a picture of the Woollen Mills looking from the top of Mount Melville. In its early days, you can see the area that it took up. It took up a whole block between Mill Street, quite logically, and Parade Street. The site is still there, the Woollen Mills no longer exist. So it employed quite a sizable percentage of the town, men and women. Women were allowed to work in the woolen mills, young women, of course, unmarried, and some of the earliest processors were young women. It, for a time, worked around the clock, and people around town would set their watches by the woolen mill siren, the lunchtime siren for 12 o'clock. And in the newspapers at the time, have a look at some of this. It's the way to prosperity. Woolen mill opened at Albany, a state enterprise launched by the governor. And reading on, the eyes of the state were focused on Albany on Thursday, and a very substantial portion of its outside population augmented the big gathering I think it's specimens at the official opening ceremony at the first woolen mill erected in Western Australia. It was a great day. And the governor, who would regularly come to Albany for summer holidays, was entranced with the place, and he foresaw a great future for the woolen mills in Albany. But there were some problems. Many of the 20s projects and enterprises seemed to have problems associated with them. And one of the problems with the woolen mills was, of course, its siting, its location. The location wasn't ideal. It was in the middle of a town. These days, it wouldn't have passed environmental standards. The amount of chemicals that were sent into the harbour was legendary. The harbour at times would turn blue with the colourings that were sent through the mills and just ditched into the harbour. It was noisy. It was disruptive. And Albany was a long way from anywhere, from overseas markets. The same problem that plagued Kendalup. We were just too far away. So getting the produce to market, getting the woolen product to market, was a difficulty for the woolen mills. So it ebbed and flowed. After that initial enthusiasm by the governor and the mayor and all the investors of Albany that put money into stocks and shares to get the project going, it ebbed and flowed. It had high points. During the Second World War in the 1940s, it produced a lot of uniforms, but eventually, over time, the need for woolen products died off, and the woolen mills foundered and eventually closed many years later. The governor himself actually loved Albany, and this is one of the quotes from his opening speech at the Albany Woollen Mills. He said, "I regard Albany as a perfectly beautiful spot. It's a pattern from, or a pattern for, the most beautiful parts of Scotland." His Excellency the Governor is a splendid speaker, and when he had so expressed himself in a manner which left no doubt of his sincerity at the reception arranged in his honour at the Town Hall on Wednesday morning. So at least we had vice-regal approval, even if all of our enterprises were not going so well. We'll move on from the Woollen Mills to another controversy of the 1920s, something that animated Albany in the early years. But before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about the international situation of Albany and how it found itself in this decade. Albany since 1900 had suffered the loss of a lot of shipping. Why was that? Well, you're probably aware that Fremantle Harbour was opened in the late 19th century, officially in 1900 actually. And Fremantle, of course, took a lot of the shipping from Albany. The port dwindled. The work died down for the waterside workers, the lumpers. And even though there was a bit of a spike, I suppose, during the war, as convoys came and went from Europe, after the war, it died down again. And Albany was desperate to try and get its shipping back on track. But the 1920 Navigation Act really put paid to that. Now, this was a federal act. And I won't go into great details about it. It actually started on the books in 1912, but with the intervention of the war, it wasn't promulgated until 1920. The effect of this Navigation Act was profound. It really concentrated shipping on the bigger ports of Australia. And smaller ports like Albany suffered. So ports like Fremantle, like Adelaide, even Bunbury, did better out of the Navigation Act because product and traffic was limited to these smaller ports, and they weren't going to get the investment that they needed to maintain their place as major ports in Australia. Now, even though Albany protested, and it was quite ironic that a Royal Commission was called to look into the Navigation Act, the chair of the Royal Commission was actually the member for Forest, John Prowse, who represented Albany. But despite that, the Royal Commission came to no firm conclusions, and the Navigation Act continued. And it continued to affect Albany's shipping traffic, which then was very limited to limited exports and imports. It certainly was a far cry from those huge shipping days of the 1890s. But back to Dog Rock. I'm sure from wherever you're watching, Dog Rock's a familiar sight. It's an icon of Albany, even though that's an overused word, I'm sure you will agree. And Dog Rock is, this is a picture, a postcard from the 1920s. But Dog Rock nearly wasn't there, because in 1921 it was proposed that Dog Rock be moved or destroyed. How would you move a rock like that? The town population got very animated. There were letters to the paper. This is from the Albany Advertiser, 1921. "Sir, it will not yet be forgotten that at a meeting of ratepayers recently convened by the Mayor, for the express purpose of considering the proposal to mutilate the Dog Rock, 2 resolutions were carried. That the Dog Rock be not interfered with in any way, and B, that the Council take immediate steps to secure a strip of land opposite the rock in order to widen the road." And this was the problem with Dog Rock. The road was too narrow for this increasing traffic. Motor cars were beginning to arrive in Albany. It was deemed a traffic hazard. It needed to be moved. And also, it was deemed a hazard to children, because guess what? Children would climb on the rock and might injure themselves. So, the suggestion by the council was it be moved or destroyed. Just imagine that. How you'd move it, I had no idea. Everyone got very animated. And the mayor at the time was Edward Balston, who we met earlier. And he was the subject of many vituperative letters to the newspaper. This is one that was unsigned. The average ratepayer without hesitation sums up the matter thus. Councillor Balston wishes the rock to be removed. The ratepayers do not agree with Councillor Balston. Therefore, Councillor Balston is angry with the ratepayers and, as a consequence, rude to the minister. This writer goes on to write, in the interests of the town, he should not act, this is Councillor Balston, he should not act like a disappointed child when his ideas are not endorsed by the citizens, fly into a temper and be lacking in the courtesy which is due to a minister of the Crown, whose assistance and sympathy will, in all probability, be again and again sought in the future by the council. Albany has nothing to gain and much to lose if her councillors act in the petulant manner displayed on this occasion and are totally lacking in the tact which the ratepayers expect them to observe. Signed, yours, Mr. Common Sense. Well, common sense prevailed and the town held a referendum to decide on whether Dog Rock should be kept or removed. And the referendum results were in favour of keeping it, luckily. 405 to 267 from memory. And hence we have Dog Rock looking like it does today, with a protective collar to make sure that when you're driving past you don't run into it. And guess what? Children still run up Dog Rock. And sure, there might be a few grazes and cuts, but who cares? We've still got our rock. Now, still in the 1920s, well, the very early part, because in 1919, this event occurred, Albany got a new newspaper, the Albany Dispatch, which you can see on the screen. A grand masthead greeted it, and the Albany Dispatch was set up by a group of individuals who were not happy with the way that the council was going and with the way that the present newspaper, the Albany Advertiser, was portraying the town and council. They thought they were very negative. The Albany Dispatch was launched in a blaze of publicity and wanted to be a different sort of paper. It wanted to promote Albany as a tourist destination, something that had been sadly lacking during that wartime period, of course. So it had all sorts of ideas for promoting Albany as a health resort, our clean air, our clear skies, our climate. All of these things were going to attract people to come to Albany. And to do that, they encouraged the building of roads. Little Grove was an area that was opened up in the 1920s. A road was built out there. But they also had a couple of ideas about the council, and they prompted the council to actually, well, I guess possibly you describe it these days as to have a bit of a meltdown, because they looked into council funding and they thought that the council wasn't being as transparent as it could be over council funds, and in particular over the electric lighting plant, which was a privatised affair. They wanted the council to build one of its own for the community. There was a great upheaval in the council. The Dispatch got everyone very animated, and eventually the council all resigned and elections were held. And that was when Councillor Balston, we've just heard about him with the Dog Rock controversy, that was when he became mayor. The Albany Dispatch also promoted briefly the New States movement. What was the New States movement, for goodness sake? Well, it was an idea that originated in the northern part of New South Wales. And the northern part of New South Wales, based around Armidale and Tamworth, wanted to secede from the rest of New South Wales and set up its own state. And this idea was briefly looked into in Albany, to create a southern part of Western Australia as a separate state, with, guess what, Albany as capital, and to build a rail line between Albany and Kalgoorlie. Of course, we still had quite a few links with the goldfields. There were several meetings, and the chief promoter of this scheme, Dr. Earl Page, who was a country doctor in New South Wales, later became Prime Minister of Australia, he promoted this idea, and he came to Albany and actually came to several public meetings, but the whole idea faded and folded in attractiveness later on. Albany also entertained itself by cinema, and we talked about the cinema earlier when we were discussing the town hall, which was the site of most of the films in town. Films were very popular, of course, pre-television days. Everybody went to the films. And in 1920, there were 2 cinema venues in Albany, the Town Hall and the Empire Theatre, corner of York Street and Stirling Terrace. Building is still there. But a third theatre opened up in 1925. Interestingly, and this is it here, the Regent Cinema, also in York Street, just a few doors, couple of doors up from the Empire Theatre. And interestingly, in the same week that the Woollen Mills opened. So it was a big week for Albany in January 1925. The Regent Theatre, if you live in Albany, go down there and have a look. That building is still there. The theatre is no longer there, but the shop's underneath it and the building still exists. So the Regent Cinema, another private enterprise by the Lambert family, aimed to profit on the popularity of films. They started out as silent films. By the end of the decade, the first talkies had appeared in Albany. Here's a picture of the foyer of the Regent Theatre. It was very grand, like theatres were. I think this photo was taken a little bit later. But certainly it was a grand night out, and the films were on 2 nights a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays generally, and normally they were packed. This picture here shows the opening of the Regent Cinema. There we are, 19th of February 1925 actually on that picture. Seated, I think about 400 or 500 people, and packed there, 2 layers. Remember you might remember the stalls, the front stalls were the cheap seats, the back stalls and the lounge and dress circle upstairs. And typically there were newsreels, there were short features, there were serials, and then a main feature itself. This report of the opening of the Regent Theatre talks about the first film that was going to be shown, The Hummingbird, which features Gloria Swanson. This film, The Hummingbird, was described as a story of Paris, as its underworld is said to be her greatest achievement in motion photography, and as a picture in every way suited to such an auspicious occasion as the opening of the Regent Cinema. Special supporting features will include a 2-reel comedy, gazettes, Australian and American, and scenic studies. Special music will also be provided. Here's a poster from that film, The Hummingbird, and you can see it on the screen now. It talks about Gloria Swanson, the Hummingbird, and with special attractions as well. That's come from the newspaper at the time, and a story of Apache Paris it's billed at. And here's a lovely, almost Art Deco poster of Gloria Swanson in The Hummingbird, a Paramount picture. Let's move on from Albany a little bit and look at the hinterland and some of the projects there as well in the 1920s. And one of the biggest, but again not very successful, one of the biggest and grand ideas came from this man here, Sir James Mitchell. Now, he had ideas of populating the southwest of West Australia. When he was Minister for Lands in the late 1910s, he became Premier in the early 1920s of WA. So was able to put some of these schemes and ideas that he had into effect. So he wanted to populate the southwest and turn it into productive farmland. He saw no use for trees. Southwest was full of trees. He wanted to create a dairy industry in the southwest of WA so that we were not reliant on eastern states' dairy product. It was a great idea. But how well had he thought it through? This was the key thing. He also wanted to bring migrants into the state. West Australia was quite underpopulated at the time. So he saw an opportunity in war-ravaged Britain to bring migrants from Britain to Western Australia and offer them an opportunity to get their own land, to become farmers and create produce for the whole of West Australia. Now, In the earlier days, before this settlement scheme, which was later to be called the Group Settlement Scheme, was started in the 1920s, some early settlers had gone out to Kendalup, and this is the Boulanger family. The Boulangers still live in Albany and around and about. So there was already some settlement in that part of the world, in the big forests behind Walpole, behind Kendalup. But Mitchell wanted to actually bring more agriculture, to bring more industry, to join pioneers like the Boulangers, who were refugees from France. He wanted to open up the area by building railways. A railway was built from Denmark to Kendalup, and to link the settlements that he was proposing all the way between there. Now, the group settlement scheme also populated the whole of the southwest. It wasn't just Denmark to Kendalup. There was a group settlement around Northcliffe, around Manjimup, around Margaret River, around even south of Perth in places like Baldivis and Rockingham. How did it work? Well, looking at this picture of Tingledale Hall, you can see that there were many families involved. If you look closely, there are men, women, children, people of all generations. Families were encouraged. Families were given the promise to actually buy, they could pay it off later, 160 acres of land. But there was a catch, that you had to clear the land first. But you didn't have to clear it all yourself. You worked as a group. And in the group there were 10 or 12 families, and you worked together cooperatively. You worked on one block of land, you'd cleared that block of 160 acres, and then someone was ready to move in. Now, how was this decided? It was decided by ballot. Your name, if you were lucky, was picked out of the hat, and then you had a farm to farm. But you still had your obligations to help your fellow group settlers, your groupies, to clear their land as well. It sounded simple, it sounded cooperative, it sounded workable, but there were quite a few pitfalls that James Mitchell and his advisors did not foresee. Number one was the land, the suitability of the land. The size of the trees defied anyone's expectations. Tales of people coming from cities in England to be confronted by huge carrion tingle trees really defeated them. And it was a long and lengthy task to clear any useful arable land in any of these areas. Around Denmark, around Manjimup, all of those parts of the world. Secondly, once the land was cleared, it was found that animals did not thrive. They constantly died, were undernourished and died. So it was obvious that the land was not capable of supporting animals, but nobody knew why this was the case. It was called the Denmark wasting disease, but nobody knew the solution until in the 1930s, agricultural scientists worked out that the land was deficient of nutrients, of trace elements like cobalt and selenium. So the superphosphate was developed, which actually rectified that problem to some extent, but by which time many of the group settlers had moved on. They'd walked off their land. They couldn't cope. They couldn't make a living. It was just too hard. So these happy settlers at Tingledale Hall, many of them did not continue. Their land was bought up by others in the groups, and this area around Tingledale was settled by families like the Edmonds and the Ravenhills, who are still around there in that part of the world today. So, look, it was not a great success, the group settlement scheme. Again, a Royal Commission looked into it and said exactly what I have said, that it was unviable from the start. The expectations were too great. It was not properly costed. The commitment was not there from the government to help these settlers, who in many cases had never even been on a farm before. So by the 1930s, the group settlement scheme had petered out, and of course by the 1930s, we'd had the Great Depression had started as well. So there was even less chance for settlers to thrive. Let's move on to happier things. By the 1920s, motor cars were becoming more popular and more affordable, although it was only the richer families in town that had a car. This picture showing the railway station and the town jetty, probably in the late 1920s, shows how built up it was. And traffic and transport was still between Perth and Albany mainly by rail and some by ship. But we did have something to celebrate in Albany in 1927. We had a centenary. And here's the front cover of the centenary number from the Western Mail, a weekly newspaper which later became the Countryman. And the Western Mail decided to celebrate Albany's centenary. Now, a bit of background for people that aren't familiar with Albany and West Australian history. Albany was founded 2.5 years before Perth, so Albany's centenary, of course, came 2.5 years before Perth's did. In 1927, well, technically 1926, but it ran into 1927. So there were moves to celebrate 100 years of European settlement in Albany on the south coast, formerly known as King George's Sound, sometimes known and preferred by the gentleman that you're looking at now, Major Edmund Lockyer, who preferred the name Frederickstown, but then in 1832 became Albany. So the Western Mail promoted the centenary, and with a big supplement with Albany's 100 years. And if you go back and look at that issue of January 1927 of the Western Mail, which you can still look at online, you'll see a lot of Albany history there and a lot of memories and recollections of early days. And you can see on that first page, Albany's first days, discovery and settlement, and by a gentleman named J.S. Batty, who of course was the first state librarian, a historian, and the J.S. Batty Library in the State Library of WA is of course named in his honour. So it was a celebration time in Albany. Crowds gathered, speeches were made, and this picture here shows some of the crowds gathering at the Residency building, which of course now is the home of the Museum of the Great Southern, which is bringing you this talk today. It was a good day. There were big crowds there. There were crowds along the foreshore, and the foreshore has changed a lot since then. This is looking back from the Residency building towards Mount Clarence, and you can see some of the big buildings and warehouses, Henry Wilson Co. along the foreshore, looking towards, I think you can just about see the tower of the old post office in the background. There were bands, you can see band members there. There were speeches, there were reenactments, there was everything. There was period costume being worn. There was all sorts of things to raise the spirits of Albany folk at that time. Interesting that the state government didn't really want to have a lot to do with Albany at that period, and reluctantly agreed to support the centenary celebrations. They really wanted to put their efforts into the centenary of Western Australia, which was to follow 2 years later in 1929. They voted to give Albany £500, I believe, to put towards the celebrations, and you can imagine that that didn't go very far at all. But still, we had a good time. And with our centenary coming up in a few years' time, I'm sure we'll be able to look back at those scenes from 1927 and think as to what has changed in the last century. So what did happen in Albany in the 1920s? Well, tourism and the beach continued. This is a picture of Katanning days. Tourists would come from Katanning on the train and come to Albany for a few days by the seaside. You can see everybody there dressed up to go to the beach in their long dresses and hats, with horse and carriage on the beach, the jetty at Ellen Cove, which was popular, and swimming, which has always taken place at Middleton Beach ever since Europeans arrived in 1826-27. So tourism was going to be a big part of Albany's future. And the motor car, of course, was another big part. The motor car was coming. Roads needed to be widened, to be built, to be made accessible. And to finish off, here's a group of happy Albany mechanics in the 1920s from one of the motor firms in Albany, Manly Motors, around one of the early motor cars. And obviously they're having their lunch break and were told to pose. But it's interesting to see how the car was going to take over in Albany's present and future in the years ahead. These were mechanics of the 1920s. Look, I hope that's given you some inkling of what Albany was like 100 years ago and more. It was a different time. And perhaps you've got in your archives and your memories of your ancestors some stories. We'd be happy to hear them. We'd love to hear some of these questions or comments. Get in touch with us at the Museum of the Great Southern. And we'll be doing more of these for you as well, I'm sure. But for now, thank you for listening.